Okay, section 3, we're going to finish up chapter 19 with the Japanese difference, the rise of a new East Asian power. And this is a great section because we learned about so many similarities between the Chinese and the Ottomans, but yet in Japan it's very different. And that's what this section is focused on. Okay, Japan was forced to open up to more normal relations with the world by U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry in 1853. And from then on until about 1900, there was a radical transformation of Japanese society. Japan became more powerful, modern, united, industrialized, and really created its own East Asian empire. Okay, the Tokugawa background. The Tokugawa shoguns had ruled since about 1600, and the main task was in preventing civil war among those rival feudal lords, the daimyo. The shogun, the daimyo, the samurai, and the emperor, after the devastating civil wars of the 16th century, the Tokugawa system established about 2.5 centuries of peace. And the real power lay in the hands of the hereditary military dictator, the shogun. And here from the Tokugawa family ruled from Edo, which is present-day Tokyo. The shogun held power over the regional feudal lords, the daimyo, making them spend alternate years in attendance at the Tokugawa court to keep them under control. And the daimyo each had a force of hereditary warriors known as samurai. So I bet you're starting to see a strong similarity between the shogunates in Japan with medieval Europe. And the emperor was relegated to a symbolic role, essentially, in his palace in Kyoto. So he didn't have, it was more symbolic as a head of state as opposed to actually having real political power. And while the country was pacified, it was not unified, as the daimyo lords had a considerable amount of independent power in their own domains. So the daimyo were restricted and regulated, but they did retain some considerable autonomy within their own areas. And so without the Japanese being unified by a single law, currency, central authority, it only really came down to their unification at a local level. But there was a hierarchical society within their culture. The samurai were at the top. Then basically everyone else, peasants, artisans, merchants, all were at the bottom. And this 250 years of peace, it put a system to the end of the previous civil wars and the bloodshed by breaking the daimyo and forbidding the samurai to fight. It also tried to freeze Japanese society by making all professions hereditary and establishing clear laws on dress and social status and really segregating the different classes. And so there was considerable change in Japan in the Tokugawa period. The samurai are the ones that evolved into the bureaucratic or administrative class. They saw great economic growth, commercialization, and significant amounts of urban development. And by 1750, Japan was actually perhaps the most urbanized country in the world. And they had considerably high literacy rates in comparison to other parts of commercialized areas. 40% of males were literate and 15% of females were literate, which for the time is considerably high. And change made it impossible for the shogunate to freeze their society. So this urban and commercial and literate people really prolonged peace and allowed the Japanese economy to flourish, resulting in increased urbanization. I think at one point Edo reached about 1 million people, and thus spreading a dynamic commercial sector and widespread literacy. And eventually, here comes the samurai status versus the merchant wealth. The era wasn't without conflict. Foremost were tensions between the samurai and the merchants. The warriors were the hereditary elite. And there were no wars to fight, so they became bureaucrats and accountants for their daimyo lords. And they held a high social status but had little wealth, no way to prove their valor. Meanwhile, the merchants, who vilified in the Japanese variant of Confucianism, were increasingly wealthy and often loaned money to their social superiors. Nonetheless, there was increasing social instability. The wealth spread throughout society, and some lower status peasants began to or became unable to afford the trapping of the elite, and widespread corruption and the failure of the government to respond to a major famine, I think it was in the 1830s, encouraged various revolts and uprisings, and including the attack on merchants and even the burning of Osaka in 1837. And so the Americans intruded. The United States sent Commodore Matthew Perry, in 1853, and he was there to demand better treatment for castaways, the right to refuel, buy provisions there in Japan, and the opening of more trade ports. But the shogun's spinelessness triggered a civil war. In 1868, a group of young samurai from the south took over. They claimed to be restoring the 15-year-old Emperor Meiji to power and aimed to save Japan from the foreigners by transforming Japanese society rather than by resisting. And so taking influence in some forms of selective borrowing from the West, that's how they aimed to save Japan, as opposed to falling to foreign and Western influence. But lucky for Japan, the West wasn't as interested in Japan as it was in China. Remember, China is where all the luxury items were from and originated from. So that's why the West was more interested in China as opposed to the West. All right, let's look at modern. Oh yeah, I forgot about this image. This is a great image. So, who are the two men in this drawing? And do you see any of their features that seem more pronounced than others? Well, and you might actually confuse these, but Admiral Perry, Commodore Perry, is on the right, and his second in command is here on the left. Both are obviously U.S. naval officers who traveled to Japan to force those trade relations on the Japanese. Notice how their eyebrows and their noses seem really oversized, and their skin looks wrinkled and sickly. The hair's receding and unappealing. And they look remarkably similar. So how do you think the artist felt about the arrival of Americans in Japan? Well, there's little doubt that the artist had only disdain for Commodore Perry and his mission and those that came with him. And based on the angry expressions on the men's faces, the artist must have considered them rude or boorish. And the uniforms of the two officers are not very detailed, which means that the artist probably wasn't impressed by the Americans' regalia or even their status. Okay. Let's look at modernization Japanese style. So the first task was creating a national unity amongst the Chinese. They attacked the power and privileges of the daimyo and the samurai, dismantled that Confucian-based social order. Almost all Japanese became legally equal, and this was rather important. So it was also a sort of defensive but revolutionary reforms. While Japanese modernization was a defensive program designed to stave off those Western countries and Western penetration, the changes were truly revolutionary and dramatically remade Japan in the space of a generation. And importantly, the Meiji reforms created a coherent and centralized Japanese state out of the feudal regionalism that was the Tokugawa shogunate. And there was widespread interest in many aspects of the West, from science to hairstyles. Official missions were sent to the West to learn and to study. Hundreds of students were sent abroad, and several Western books, were translated into Chinese. And so this was almost like a systematic dismantling of the old social order, right? Get rid of that old Confucian Tokugawa era. The daimyo lords were replaced with authorities from the centralized state. The samurai were disbanded. Those warriors lost their privileges, their social prestige, including the exclusive right to wear their swords. And indeed, all Japanese became commoners, equal citizens before the emperor. And that said, most elite Japanese found prestigious jobs in the new national military or growing government sector. And so there was a huge popularity of Western learning and technology, and even the social mores. And there was an early enthusiasm for everything Western, from dress and dancing and education. And eventually, though, the Japanese settled down to a more selective borrowing from the West. After an initial period of wholesale adoption of things Western, the Japanese began to select certain aspects of the West and fuse them with the various cultural traditions that already existed in Japan. The Meiji Constitution, for example, was modeled on the German Constitution, but stated that it was a gift from the emperor who descended from the sun goddess. And the universal education system blended Western science with Confucian ideology. But Christianity made rather little progress in Japan, as Shinto was raised to a level of almost a state cult, and became the official religion in Japan. However, the Japanese recognized that the oppression of women really impeded on their modernization efforts, and thus a universal education, but segregated by sex. So men and women were able to learn, but they were still kept separate. And women were still prohibited from public life. But the the centralized state really guided the industrialization programs. They established model factories, opened mines, built railroads, created postal and telegraph lines, and even banking systems. So at the center of Meiji modernization was a state-guided industrialization program. And to speed up the process and to promote large-scale industry, the government favored the formation of these huge, large industrial combines. And it was really just the space of a generation that the Japanese reform program radically transformed Japan into, on a global scale, a modern industrial society. But it was, it didn't come without, without some drawbacks. Many state enterprises were then sold to private investors around the world, and or not around the world, but private investors within Japan. So it did accomplish modernization without acquiring much foreign debt. But society paid a heavy price for this. Many peasant families were impoverished. The countryside suffered infanticide, the sale of daughters, and famine, and early urban workers received harsh treatment from those above them, and the efforts to organize unions were significantly repressed. And so while the Japanese industrialization process was quick and rather successful, it did create tremendous suffering at the lower end of the social strata. Peasants found life increasingly difficult, often sold their daughters just to support themselves, and many of these girls went into the textile industry, where they worked long hours for low wages, lived in very unpleasant factory dormitories. In opposition to this new industrial social order, the radical leftists began to flirt with socialism and anarchism. And in 1911, a feminist anarchist was hanged for allegedly conspiring to kill the emperor. So went a little far with some in Japan. By the early 20th century, the Western powers had, okay, we're on Japan and the world. The Western powers had readjusted their treaties to work in Japan's favor. And thus began a time of Japanese empire building. They fought wars against China in 1894 and 1895 in the Sino-Japanese War, and against Russia in 1904 and 1905 in the Russo-Japanese War. These two wars showed that Japan was now a modern military power. Its defeat of Russia was noteworthy. It was the first defeat of a major European power in the recent era of imperialism. And Japan, and they gained colonial control over different areas, taking territory from China and Russia, Taiwan and Korea, and even won a foothold in Manchuria. And so, thanks to these two victories in these wars, Japan engaged in its own version of empire building. And they received a lot of admiration from the colonial world, while those colonized by Japan might disagree. Many people from, Poland and other places around the world, even the Dutch East Indies, looked to Japan with hope and inspiration. It became a symbol of standing up to the West. Nonetheless, Japan's colonial policies were as brutal as those of their European counterparts. And here's a map that shows you, here's Japan in this lighter green color, with their major Japanese railroad, which is excellent. It's a small country, which they're able to do, but, and you see the major industrial areas in Hiroshima, Osaka, Kyoto, and Tokyo. But you see what they gained from China in 1910, and then from Russia by the early 19-teens. And that is the end of Chapter 19, Empires in Collision, Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia. I will see you for reflections, looking at the successes and failure in history.